Good afternoon. Nice to have a few friends in the audience. Thank you guys for hanging in this late on a Wednesday. I hope none of you are quite as exhausted as I am, but been a great event. Happy to be here and have a little conversation about what we're building at Civitas Learning. I will try to make some time available at the end for questions. So if you have any, prepare for that. First of all, just a few basics about us. We were founded in 2011. We launched our first products and started actually selling in 2013. We are a SaaS platform. We're focused on higher education as a starting point, and I'll talk a little bit about sort of the bigger vision of what we're building towards. We now have better than 300 higher ed customers who serve about 30% of the students across higher education. So from an institution count perspective, south of 10%, but they tend to be quite large institutions that we've started our work with early. Headquartered in Austin, Texas, and we have offices in the obvious other places you would always have an office, Chico, California, and London. Some acquisition backstory, as you might expect to that. And then we're about 200 strong these days. We've raised a little better than $70 million in equity capital so far. We are, a number of us, sort of from education. I myself am a serial education entrepreneur. I completely accidentally fell in love with teaching when I was an undergrad, working my way through school nights and weekends. Ended up buying the education company that I had been teaching for when I graduated, bought it for debt. For some reason, they were willing to accept that, and it happened to be the only thing that I had. And so I sort of started my journey as an education entrepreneur literally at the age of 22, built 3 ed tech companies straight out of school, sold the first of them to Kaplan, spent 9 years as an in-house entrepreneur at Kaplan, left Kaplan in 2011 to start this business. My co-founder, Mark Milliron, was former president of the League for Innovation, has been an administrator at colleges and universities, was also the deputy director of post-secondary improvement for the Gates Foundation. And we've brought together a really diverse set of talent, folks who have spent a career in education as I have, and others who are brand new to education but have built some phenomenal skill sets elsewhere. Dave Kill, in particular, our chief scientist, was the founding data scientist at Humana. Lots of sort of through lines between healthcare and education in this work in data science, and I think our executive team is reflective of that. So, really from the start in kind of building a leadership team to go attack this opportunity, we've tried to include a diversity of different backgrounds, not just education lifers like myself, but folks who have built a really diverse set of skills in other industries and can bring those to bear on solving the extremely difficult problems that we spend our days working on. We're trying to do something fairly small and at Civitas, and that is, I'll take the requisite globe shot here, making the most of the world's learning data. So conceptually, as a career education entrepreneur, having spent 20 years building businesses in this space, it's always been a source of frustration for me that we know so little about the differences between things that work and things that don't. The level of empirical support for the decisions that get made across the education lifecycle is pretty thin. And generally speaking, the relationship between decisions we make and investments we make in education and the kinds of outcomes that we're trying to achieve is opaque. And so we think there's an opportunity to make dramatically better use of the world's learning data to help solve that problem, bring more transparency to that relationship between inputs and outputs in the operation of educational institutions, even as they're becoming dramatically more diverse. That said, we've got to start somewhere, and the place that we have started is really with a particular focus on American higher education. Part of my journey included a stop at Kaplan University. I've got some former colleagues in the audience. At KU, I was responsible for our academic organization for a period of time, COO of academics, and in that role had accountability for persistence and graduation, for outcomes with kind of post-traditional students, some tough student populations to serve effectively. And it occurred to me in that role that we had an enormous amount of data and yet literally no ability to pull out of that data. We couldn't even particularly effectively at the time forecast where our persistence rates were likely to be term over term. We built those forecasts based on looking at last year's persistence numbers and adding 50 basis points of hope. Felt like there ought to be a way to learn a little more than that from the data that we had in our student systems, potentially to build some predictions that help us inform better decisions along the student life cycle and ultimately get to better outcomes for the students that we were working with. It occurred to me in that moment that if that was a problem we were struggling to solve with the level of sophistication and resource sort of metrics orientation we had in an organization like Kaplan, it was probably a problem that was unsolved across higher education. As I dug into that a little more deeply, found out that this sort of worst case scenario that I was trying to solve for at Kaplan University, worst case scenario not being that a student never starts higher education, worst case scenario being a student starts higher education, spends time, acquires debt, and acquires a sense that college isn't for them, but doesn't ever acquire a credential. We wanted to solve for that sort of worst case outcome first. And as I dug into that, I found out there's an awful lot of Americans in precisely that situation. 35 million American adults who have some college but no credential. And by definition, some part of their story is captured in the systems of record of American higher education. They almost all attended some college or university, in many cases several colleges and universities, and so there's a record there, there's a trail, there are footprints of their journey. The challenge is, just as I struggled with it in that seat at KU, higher education infrastructure in this country doesn't have the ability to actually consume that data, make sense of it, and learn from those footprints, learn from those students' journeys. That's the problem that we're working on solving. And very specifically, we are a software company that has set a numerical target and a due date for ourselves. Our mission, our starting mission, and it is galvanizing to everything that we do at Civitas, is to get 1 million more students across the stage with a post-secondary credential that has labor market value per year by 2025. That's a suspiciously large and round number, I will admit, but it's actually a number that has been triangulated to by a number of non-government agencies, departments of education, departments of labor. It reflects the pace that we're on as a higher education infrastructure will leave us with a gap of about 1 million post-secondary credentialed graduates by 2025 between what the economy needs to remain competitive globally and what we're on pace to create as a higher education ecosystem. When you break that goal apart, what's required is about 350 basis points in improvement in term-over-term persistence. So obviously lots and lots of ways to try to solve this problem. You could attempt to create an entirely new educational infrastructure, stand up some brand new universities, try to add sort of accretively by expanding access. Those are all problematic for reasons that folks here would probably well understand. It's actually not that big of an improvement in the rate at which we help students stay in school term over term that's required to close that gap in its entirety. What it does take is really two things. It takes reach and impact. So if you can get access to a broad swath of higher education, institutions and students, if you got access to 100% of them and you could have a 3.5%, 350 basis point improvement in term over term persistence, you would solve this problem entirely. If you can only get access to half of them on the off chance that you can't get to every single college or university, then you've got to have a 7% impact on persistence in order to close that gap in its entirety. So again, this is sort of the galvanizing mission for us. It's how we think about the work we do. It's how we think about the partners we want to work with. My alma mater is a place where everybody graduates, and they're not likely to be a customer of ours anytime. We aren't in the business of solving problems for institutions that don't have any challenges to work through. So we're focused on institutions that serve students at scale, that serve students that are populations of students that can be challenged and challenging to get through to completion. And we're always working to find the most efficient and effective methods to get to outcomes. We have, from the beginning, been selling outcomes in this market, not selling software. So on the reach front, here's how the sort of progress we've made over the course of the last few years. I mentioned we launched our first products and really started expanding beyond our initial unpaid betas in 2013, really fourth quarter of 2013. Since then, we've expanded our community pretty dramatically. As I mentioned earlier, working with a little better than 300 colleges and universities. Those schools enroll about 7 million students. On the back end, that has, for us, meant that we've got a data set in our platform of better than 20 million students and 200 million course enrollment records. And at any given time, we've got, actually that number's closer to 2,500 now, machine learning models in the cloud that are running continuously across the customer set that we serve. Our theory of work is really mass experimentation. The approach that we're taking was not to build one skinny solution and then hope like heck that that skinny solution solved problems in the most linear and efficient possible way. It was instead to operate on this instinct and this hypothesis that there's enough signal in the data to accurately predict which students are on a path to succeed or not, And then the following hypothesis to that, which is if we could actually build actionable predictions and start to expose the things that drive those predictions, we could probably inform better decisions across the student life cycle that drive very directly improved outcomes. There are no shortage of hypotheses as to the best ways to use data and analytics in education. And honestly, we've been engaged for the last 6 years in trying to find the most efficient connections between this work and student outcomes. Said another way, we've spent an enormous amount of energy trying to figure out what are the use cases that are most helpful in getting traditional higher education institutions to effectively metabolize these capabilities around data and analytics and convert them into quantifiably, repeatably improved student outcomes. That has been our work, and it really is a function of mass experimentation across the entire community of institutions we've put together. I use that word purposefully. Civitas is Latin for community, and this is such a sort of ingrained piece of who we are that we literally named the business after this concept of a community of institutions working together to try to solve this set of problems of student success, and in particular, the effect that analytics can have on that solution. Another founding sort of component of our theory of work is that there just are no average students. The way we tend to think about solving problems in higher education is with averages, with single data points on which we make gigantic decisions on behalf of students. And a lot of the early phase of our work has been exploding some of that dogma, some of those presumptions that exist in the space. If any of you happen to have seen our Community Insights reports, we are now on a pretty regular cadence releasing deep sort of first-person research out of this now 5 or 6 million student data set that we have. And we're finding some things that are surprising to traditional educators. This is a great example. Your typical college or university thinks of risk of dropping out primarily along the axis of academic success, right? GPA, pretty good indicator of whether a student's in trouble or not. Sufficient academic progress would seem to be a pretty good indicator of whether a student's in trouble or not. What we found is across our entire data set, literally any given term, 78% of the students who drop out have over a 2.0. 2.0 happens to be the tipping point of the flag that most institutions use to determine whether students are at risk or not. You may have heard C's get degrees. That's not actually true. The largest group, if you split all the students up into 0 to 2.0, 2.0 to 3.0, and 3.0 to 4.0, the largest group of non-persisters among all of those is actually students who are above a 3.0. So that sort of insight, identifying it at the community level and then dropping it all the way down to an actual set of actions that result in improved student outcomes is literally the heart and soul of the work that we're doing at Civitas. Explode existing dogma around what data matters and how it matters, and then work on how to action it at the individual student level. This is literally the manifestation of this sort of fixation on the wrong sets of data, sort of bluntly applied, that we see across much of higher education. A 2.0 trigger gets it right about 20% of the time. A predictive model that's got a bit more nuance, that's including data from the learning management system, student information system, CRM system, will nearly always be in the 80s in predictive accuracy, and that's on the first day of the course. Those accuracy levels go up with each day or week that progresses. So that's the opportunity to improve our ability to identify kind of who's at risk and who's not. And I'll give you just one sort of case study on how you go from a community insight, which seems pretty high level and maybe not so actionable, 44% of the students that are dropping out in any given term have over a 3.0, down to actually doing something about it. So one of our partners, actually a community college system in Texas, as it turns out, saw the community insight and wondered if that was true in their institution as well. They were able to tell pretty quickly in our tool set that they had better than 2,000 students who were highly at risk and also had high GPAs, so unlikely to come back next term, and also had high GPAs. They got excited about that. Well, so we should do something about that. Let's reach out to them and say what? They literally had no idea what to say. They didn't know that being high GPA and highly at risk was a thing, so they had no mental model even on which to decide how might we support these students, what might an outreach look like. So we worked together with them, sort of built a mindset-based intervention, a note coming from their advisor, which started with congratulations on the great academic success they've had, normalized the kinds of things that can be difficult, even for students that are high achieving in a higher education environment. You don't have to get it right. You have to note the 3 or 4 things that might be going on in that student's life, and then tell them that someone is there, cares about them, is watching, understands their circumstance, and suggests that they reach out to them. That, literally, that single email across this multi-thousand student population. We did a randomized control trial, and it had a 9.5 percentage point impact on those students' persistence. What the institution referred to as a zero-cost intervention, and one of many that they can deploy several times a week centrally to move the needle. Another good example, one of the insights that we found, and this again comes from a community insight report of ours, is that students who earn C's in often in introductory writing courses, while there's literally no impact on their likelihood of persisting, nobody drops out because they got a C in writing, there's often a massive impact on their likelihood of graduating. And that graduation doesn't happen until, or lack thereof, doesn't happen until 2 or 3 years later. But we've got a lot of institutions where there may be a 30 or 40% impact on your likelihood of graduating based on the difference between getting a B and getting a C in a freshman writing course. That is something that no institution had ever considered. It's a question they'd never considered asking. It's an insight they would have never gotten to without this kind of work. And it's an insight that then becomes quite actionable as you are working on creating decision support for students and helping with some mindset guidance as they walk into courses like that early in their career that they may not have had a great understanding of the importance of. These two examples really give a sense of what for us are the two use cases that we are having the most success on and that we're really kind of organizing our work and our business around. Personalized pathways and precision support. The simplest way to think about these two sort of use cases for us are personalized pathways is about supporting the big decisions that students make on a semesterly or annual basis. So think about career exploration and understanding of what majors I ought to be considering to get into the career that I want, which courses and which combination or sequence are going to put me on a path to be successful in the major to get me into the career that I want, and then literally which sections on which days of the week are going to give me the calendar that I need to give me the best chance of being successful in those courses, get me through that major and into the career that I want. That's what Personalized Pathways is all about, and we're going deep and really integrating that decision support across that entire life cycle and using predictive analytics and previous student success stories to support better decisions throughout that. And on the precision support side, if you think about personalized pathways as being a little bit more traditional view of advising, kind of one-to-one advising, thinking about those big decisions you make every once in a while, precision support is about all the little decisions. It's sort of a one-to-many advising model. It's the ability to identify a population of students who share a common level of risk, a common driver of that risk, reach out to them with some centralized support, like that very simple example of the high-risk, high GPA students I mentioned previously, and then evaluate the efficacy of that campaign that you've delivered. We've actually built a set of tools that allows us to, within about 60 minutes, evaluate the impact on persistence of any campaign delivered through our tools or actually any other treatment that the institution's already engaged in. So we've got institutions that are using that tool, which is called Illum Impact, and just GA'd within the last quarter, to evaluate the efficacy of policy changes they've made, curricular changes they've made, other outreaches they've done outside of our system, an investment in the Writing Center, a tutoring initiative. They can literally quantify the impact each of those investments is having on persistence using our tools and understand how that impact is differentiated across different kinds of populations of students as well. So in our personalized pathways use case, we've got nearly 1 million students that use those tools just in April. 90% adoption rate among advisors within 60 days of deploying. Thousands and thousands of degree plans kind of built and submitted, and a much more rapid path to deployment than our traditional kind of full analytics infrastructure has supported before. So we've seen a ton of progress, particularly over the course of the last 6 months in the personalized pathways stack, and that's why that's one of the places we're betting on. Results from personalized pathways, just the schedule planning piece of this work has gotten to results of 3%, 4%, and 5%. The degree map piece of this work has averaged results of 11% and 12% improvements in persistence rates term over term by better supporting course and major decisions. We believe the integration of these two is going to deliver pretty consistently improvements in persistence in the teens. Which anyone who's in this presentation probably has a sense of what the financial and mission ROI to institutions looks like if you can get to double-digit persistence improvements from these kind of decision support tools. Just one example, that's actually a community college example. 1.2 million in single-year retained tuition revenue from students who didn't leave based on the experimental outcome that was delivered through the availability of DegreeMap. Precision support, again, is about delivering behavioral nudges and guidance to students, the right message to the right student at the right time from the right stakeholder at the institution. we've delivered through our tools. Our partners have millions of nudges. This year, we've had 10 times the number of those outreach campaigns as we had last year. So we're seeing a real hockey stick in the use of these tools to drive outcomes, 5 times the number of partner outcomes this year. And again, pretty consistent results of those campaigns in the 2 to 12% improvement in persistence vein. And again, that's sort of on a per campaign basis. You're not sending the same campaign to every student. You're generally sort of centrally generating and executing on a variety of campaigns that are targeted and personalized to specific populations within the institution. Results in precision support. We've had partners that have unlocked 8 figures in funding by hitting key state mandated thresholds for persistence. And again, have a stack of outcomes that have come from the effective utilization of this work. The other thing that narrowing in on those 2 use cases among the many that we have supported historically allows us to do is it frees up some space for us to really invest heavily in scaling the student insights engine. I mentioned before the data scale that we've collected already. And what we're working on now is driving improved velocity, both deployment velocity as well as dropping analytic cycle times down so that we can deploy these models more and more quickly and solve more and more problems on top of that same data infrastructure. We are very much open for business from a partnership perspective as we focus more narrowly on these 2 use cases ourselves. That gives us the ability to, I think, partner a bit more cleanly with others in the space that are interested in providing data to that platform engine or pulling scores out of that platform engine. We think there are an awful lot of problems that can be solved on top of this student success platform, and we certainly aren't going to build the solutions to all of them ourselves. So what's next for Civitas in solving this problem set and taking advantage of the start that we've got here is really kind of to move up and down in the life cycle. Ours has been a K-to-career vision from the very beginning. We started with higher ed because it is the center sort of pivot point of education data to map the academic graph in higher ed, which has been entirely under lock and key of individual institutions for an awful long time. We think puts us in a great spot to do things like build an empirical foundation for what true college readiness actually means across the student stories of 20 or 40 or 60 million higher ed students that have gone before, helping colleges and universities as well as families eventually to better understand the concept of fit or match. How well am I likely to do in a particular institution or a particular major? And then on the career side, continuing to inform more and more deeply career outcomes, starting to model against not just completion and persistence, but actually placement and career success and efficacy are all enormous opportunities to kind of take advantage of the data asset and the set of data science capabilities that we've built at Civitas going forward. And that is all I have to share with you this afternoon. So I've got about 2 minutes for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and we'll get a mic to you. I preemptively answer every possible question in this room. That is just not true. There we go.
Hi, thanks for that. I'm Mark with Newsella.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. So college graduation rates, that's one like clear metric, but
Yep.
You mentioned like career success later on. How do you incorporate that into a lot of your machine learning algorithms?
Yeah, so we've got a partnership with Burning Glass where we're starting to infuse now jobs data and the connection between those jobs, the skills that drive those jobs, and the majors and courses that students are considering and taking. For me, that was really the personalized pathways stack has always been about thinking about what are the 4 things you wish you had at your fingertips when you were making those decisions about what major to choose, implications potentially of changing majors. As I think back, I think I had none of those pieces of information at my fingertips. What are the job market implications of the major I'm considering or the courses I'm considering? What's the financial implication of a change here? What's the timing implication of a change? What's my likelihood of succeeding? Those are all the sorts of things that we can inform. The machine learning infrastructure that we've built allows us to model against any dependent variable. So the reality is that there's an enormous amount of pressure and strain around completion right now, and that is the starting point for the vast majority of our work across much of higher education. But placement data, as you ingest and incorporate that data, and that's one of the places we're looking to build some partnerships, it's pretty easy to point that same infrastructure at a different dependent variable that you're modeling against, and that would be our approach ultimately to helping institutions better understand the connection all the way through. We also have state organizations that are pulling us into some cross-institutional modeling. So ingesting K-12 data, connecting that up to those same student records in higher education, then ultimately trying to figure out how do we map and predict earlier and earlier and earlier in the student life cycle, not just whether a student will be accepted to college and or be successful in college, but actually get on a path to a career that's valuable to them. We've already started some of that cross-institutional work, and I think there'll be a lot more of that in our future.